Bonjour and hello, everybody. It's really exciting to be with another group of people who are trying to do the very hard thing of driving innovation in our government organizations. So, thank you for giving me a little bit of time to tell my story, and hopefully, we'll also have some time for you to ask questions. But I did want to sort of bring you back a little in time a little bit to when and why I started in government, which, as Vanessa mentioned, was right after the Berlin Wall came down. And on the next slide, you can see a picture of that very dramatic historic moment when an entire part of the world had essentially turned its back on a certain form of governance. As you all know, the former Soviet Union was a communist system. And in the communist conceptualization of the role of government, it was very much built around command and control. A little bit ironic, but uh, considering the name, but it was very much a centrally led management of everything in society. So the government determined what people would experience, determined where they would live, what jobs they would have, what books they would read, what radio programs they could listen to, what television they could watch. It was very much centrally controlled. And within that conceptualization of the role of government, of course, uh, it was modeled on an inside out mindset where government had the authority and exercised the authority to determine what people would experience. Once the wall came down, everything literally flipped on its head. So, to quote the musical Hamilton, the world turned upside down. And all of a sudden, countries in the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc had to completely rethink what is the role of government. Now, government had to understand what people need, listen to that, and build the systems, policies, services, programs that people were demanding and be held accountable for performance, transparency, equity. It was a very, very different proposition. So my job as a representative of the United States working in the region at the time was to teach government officials how to do this very different form of governance. I did that for 13 years. And over that period of time, of course, learned so much about systems, about policy, about people, about government, and realized more and more that the same principle applies in any democratic system, including my own. And so I made the decision to come back home, essentially after traveling nearly full time for over a decade. I decided to come back home and apply what I had learned back into my own system in the United States. So on the next slide, you will see the role that I entered is to work at the center of the United States federal government to drive transformation of how we do the work of government through our people. Because one of my big lessons from working in the former Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc, was that it is the people of government who matter most. And if you can change how they do their work and how they understand their work, you can really drive a significant amount of change and improvement. So I became an executive at our civil service system, Office of Personnel Management, and my job was to design and execute the human capital strategy of the president's management agenda. So as you can see on the left, I started under George W. Bush, who was known, you may not know this, but he was known as the first president to hold an MBA. And he had brought that training and his own expertise to bear on how he understood his job as the president and the head of the executive branch of government. So he wanted to introduce strategic management principles that he had learned and applied in his own private sector work. So we went about designing strategic human capital management as the way that our government would recruit, engage, and develop people and hold our people accountable for the performance of our organizations. Um, Working at the center of government with responsibility for over 2 million federal civilian employees and influence over the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. So that's several more millions of people. We worked at that level of strategy, policy, and sort of special initiatives. And I did that for several years, but got more and more frustrated because at that very high level, sort of uber um, strategic leadership, it's hard to see that you're moving the needle. And in fact, I don't think we did move the needle, to be quite honest. Which is why I was so excited when President Obama came in with a different approach, which was to focus on innovation. Instead of creating this big strategic framework and standards and policies and accountability, his view was very different. His view was, let's just create the right environment and unleash the potential of these 2 million people to be creative, to be innovative. And so he came into office and brought to my agency this new vision for how we would improve government through the people of government. And that was all about equipping them with the skills and the methods required to be innovative and be creative. Pretty, pretty daunting task, especially because our governments are organized by design to be very deliberate, to be risk managers, and to because we are accountable to the public. So on the next slide, you'll see one of the drivers of Obama's vision, and that was the absolute abysmal failure of his signature policy, which was to provide health insurance to the entire American population. And this was, he had campaigned hard on it, he had promised it, and he intended to deliver. So he got the Affordable Care Act passed, and then it went to implementation. And the day that we launched healthcare.gov, which is the place that every American was told to go to sign up for this newly available health insurance program, we were able to sign up 6 people. And the United States population currently stands a little shy of 350 million. So why? Because the website failed. Because of a lot of factors that had gone into how the website was designed, by whom. It involved contracting and vendors and management and all kinds of systems that collided to produce a major failure in his signature policy. So clearly he had to very quickly recover from that. And so it was all hands on deck all over government to fundamentally transform how do we provide services, policies, programs to the American public in a digital environment, which is where most people want to engage with their government. So as I said, he came to my office, the Office of Personnel Management, and on the next slide, you will see what we did. And by the way, this is the cost of fixing the failure of that website. So how did we fix it, and how did we set the stage for that kind of failure never to happen again? Next slide. This was what we were confronted with, right? This is the implication of the kind of failure of a digital interaction that on the face of it sounds like, well, okay, it was a website, big deal. Well, for government, it is a big deal. The bedrock of democracy is trust. And if government can't trust us even to get a website right, what can they trust us to get right? So next slide. We at OPM, which is the federal government's people agency, essentially, we realized that the place that we could move this needle was through equipping the people of government with the skills required to be more agile, be more adaptive, and to apply the kinds of skills and tools that had become quite common in private sector and in particular in the tech industry. So we stood up something called the lab at OPM. You're seeing a picture of that lab in the background. And the journey to even just opening the facility was a 2-year saga. So when I say that you all are doing the hard work of bringing innovation to government, I have the scars to prove it. It should not have taken 2 years to simply clean up a space and put some whiteboard paint up and roll some portable whiteboards in, but it did. Why? Because we had resistance, because we had a generation of people who had come into government understanding their role as risk managers, understanding their role as being very focused on making sure that we met our key performance indicators as spelled out by Congress, as spelled out by OMB. And clearly that had gotten us to a place where the systems we were using to do the work of government were failing, as we saw in healthcare.gov. But the recognition by some of our longstanding leaders of the connection between the way that they had chosen to do the work of government and those failures, that was something they had not recognized yet. So we had one executive in particular who had worked at the agency for 35 years. She had never worked anywhere else. She had started as a early career professional and worked her way up to become an executive. And she did not see the value in investing agency money into something like an innovation lab. So at every turn, she found ways to block us from being able to get space. And that was all we were asking for at the beginning, was just, give us some space so we can convene some people and think about what it looks like to be creative in government. So in desperation, one day we went on a walk around the building, and our building is 2 blocks from the White House. And we went down to the sub basement of the building, which I didn't even know existed until that day, and discovered that there were a bunch of storerooms in the sub basement. We found a door, it was a small door, and we checked the handle. We're able to open the door, which was a surprise. When we opened the door, what was inside this 3,000 square foot space was shelving holding blank forms, boxes of blank forms from the 70s and 80s. It wasn't data, it wasn't files, it was just blank forms. And guarding the forms was an armed guard whose job was to sit in this room. I mean, whatever, right? So, so we took pictures. We brought it back up to our front office, the head of our agency, and said, "Would you like to continue guarding blank forms, or would you like us to try this new idea that we have for how to use some space?" So he gave us that permission. So long story short, we were able to clean everything out and equip it with very mobile, light furnishings that enabled us to get creative. And so what you can see in this picture is a bunch of people in the room, and they have taken on a problem, and in that room, taken risks, right? Because we did not use fancy equipment. We didn't have the money for it. You can see a lot of Post-its. That's what we used. Paper, Post-its, pens. but but mostly the most important tool that we had at our disposal in that room was the intelligence and the passion and the expertise and the creativity of the people that we brought in. So next slide, you will see an early win that we got. And this was something that we focused on was, okay, now we had the space, but now we had to prove that we could do something important in that space that actually drove measurable improvement in something. And so we purposefully went around and sort of asked through our networks, is there a big, hairy problem that you are trying to take on that we might be able to help with? And discovered that there had been a decades-long challenge with improper payments going to the National School Lunch Program. Improper payments meaning that the school districts who needed money from the federal government weren't getting it. Other school districts were getting too much. And so the bottom line was children were trying to apply, but couldn't. And even though they should have gotten help, they didn't. So that results in child hunger and inability to learn effectively in the school environment. So what did we do about this problem? We brought the team from our food and nutrition service into the lab. They brought us quantitative data. They had a lot of quantitative data. Governments know how to do that, right? How to collect data at scale in numeric form, crunch it, produce it, and identify trends, challenges, etc. But what they didn't know was why was this happening? And so we had adopted the methods of human-centered design as the thing that we thought would actually unleash innovation and creativity in the federal workforce. So we conducted a workshop for this team, which consisted of program executives, lawyers, policy people. We assembled a cross-functional team from across food and nutrition service. We taught them human-centered design, and then we took them out to a school. And several of them told us they had never been in a school as part of their jobs, right? Because they didn't see their job as going out to a school. They saw their job as reviewing legal precedent or, doing the policy process, managing their financial system. But we made them go out to a school and we asked them to help us do this qualitative research of what was happening in the schools to see if we could generate some insights on what was going wrong with the budgeting and the financial management. And what we discovered by interviewing and observing and listening to people, from the children to the administrators to the school lunch servers to parents, is we discovered an early thing that we thought we could take action on, and that was the application form. We found out that the application form was very confusing, especially for the kinds of people who need school lunch in the first place. In my country, many of them are undocumented. Many of them do not speak English as a first language. Many of them are traumatized because of how they got here. And so you hand them this 5.5-page form that is very difficult to understand. You ask them for a lot of data that they find intrusive and frightening. And they either can't or won't fill it out. In particular, we discovered a problem with double-barreled names, which is very common in the Hispanic community, which is a large proportion of our immigrant population. And so literally in real time, while we were all at the school, we took out some paper, sketched out new formats for the application that would accommodate different cultural differences in naming, and that sort of guided people through the application. Um, we prototyped, tested, and iterated a new form. Long story short, that form is now in use across the entire United States, and it cost us 3 months of project time, 6 months of review and approval time, and $35,000 to get that thing done. And at one point, the Food and Nutrition Service told us that their estimate, their projection was that would save them $600 million over 5 years. And it's just about this different way of doing the work. They also, by the way, became huge advocates of human-centered design and are now using it in everything that they do. And that, to me, is the most important impact, right? We're actually changing how government understands the way it does its work for the better, because we're reconnecting our government employees with the people that they serve in a position of empathy so that they will listen, so that they will understand and act on what the people that we serve actually need and want. So to sort of finish out the story on the next slide, I did become involved in the team that wrote the executive order. This was a long journey, and I wanted to emphasize that in particular with this group. I mean, I started on the journey in about 2011, 2010. We did pilot projects at first. I just described one. Then we worked with the Office of Management and Budget to build budget guidance into our annual budget process. And that guidance at first recommended and then required that agencies actually do human-centered design, start applying customer experience practices. Over the years, the budget guidance became much more stringent. And at the end of the day, we were able to create an executive order that in my government, executive orders have equivalent authority as a statute. And now there is a statute in progress. It's a bill on the Hill in Congress with bipartisan support to now authorize the executive branch and require the executive branch to do exactly the kinds of things we were doing back in 2012. And that's when it's going to become an entrenched part of how we do our work moving forward. But it was a long journey. That look at the date on that executive order, right? Almost a decade. And it just takes hard work. It takes a community. And so I was really excited to hear about this convening, because one of my colleagues who brought these human-centered design practices to the Department of Defense coined the 3 M's as the way that we thought about the work we were doing. So it's methods, which can be human-centered design, it can be user experience design for digital interactions, customer experience management, right? There's methods you can bring into government. By bringing those methods and the tools associated with them, you start to transform mindsets. That's the second M, right? So methods and mindsets, that's creating the change. But the third M to me was the most important, and that's the movement, right? You could have pockets of people doing this work, but to make it stick, it had to be a movement. And we actually purposefully did the kinds of things you would do in a social movement, right? If you're trying to lead that kind of societal change. We did that as part of our strategy. So at the end of the day, we are now in a much better place over a decade later. In the next slide, you can see one of the success stories is the United States Postal Service. Just last month, it's still November, so just last month, rolled out a free COVID testing program. And you were able to go online and apply to have an at-home test kit delivered to you by the Postal Service. And the first day, they got 6 million people signed up. So we went from 6 to 6 million in a decade. I think that's a pretty good improvement trajectory there. So, um, final slide, I believe. Yeah. So I've mentioned human-centered design. Pretty sure most of you in the audience have heard of it, but it is that four-step process. I mean, that's a very simplified way of describing it. Fundamentally, what human-centered design offers is a framework through which you are encouraging and sometimes forcing government employees to think about the needs and experiences of the people that they serve and to give themselves permission to take risks. So that develop to deliver process is highly iterative. Scrappy is a word we use a lot, right? You want to take the risks when it's cheap to do so, similar to what we did in the school lunch project with a piece of paper and a little bit of time and a lot of empathy for the people that you're designing for. You can work out most of the kinks of what you think the solution is going to be before you ever spend a dime on coding, before you ever spend a dime on, infrastructure implementation. And so you're moving risk way up in the life cycle, which I believe is going to significantly improve the results in the long run. The reason I came to Qualtrics is because we have essentially automated this entire process and equipped government organizations with the ability to do this as part of how they do their work every day in our digital environments. So really happy now to answer any questions, have any continued discussion.
Fantastic.